The Victorian era is quite unsurprisingly named after Queen Victoria, who ruled England and its overseas empire from 1837 to 1901. If you time travelled back to the Victorian times, you would experience a vastly different world compared to the one you and I live in today. You would likely be struck by the differences in technology, transport, communication, fashion, and architecture. It would most definitely be an eye-opener and a fascinating opportunity to witness firsthand the events and developments that shaped the modern world as we know it today. Though, your overall experience would depend a lot on what social class you found yourself in. Being a member of the working class. If you found yourself in the working class, life would be no easy feat. It would be damn tough. Poverty was commonplace, and you would have most likely struggled to make ends meet. You would be working long hours with low pay, probably in factories or mines, for 12 to 16-hour days, 6 days a week. Conditions would be harsh, cramped and unsanitary, and the air would have been thick with dust from the coal or perhaps from the cotton being spun. The work office doesn't seem too bad now, does it? If you're a child, things would be even tougher. Children as young as 5 would end up working wretched manual jobs, often performing dangerous tasks. In Charles Dickens's novel Oliver Twist, Dickens provides a critical portrayal of the inequality of life in Victorian England. The novel exposes the cruel treatment of orphans and child labourers during this time and highlights the social and economic hardships suffered by the working class, who frequently had to endure poverty, hunger, disease, and exploitation. Most poorer families in the Victorian era would have lived in tiny homes with only a few rooms on each floor. These homes would have had one shared toilet, with water being sourced from a nearby well or pump. If you couldn't afford a place to live, you did have the option to live in the workhouses, which provided you with a place to sleep in exchange for work. However, these places were very unhygienic, and therefore residing in one would not have been a nice experience. Families would often be separated into different areas. The food was of poor quality, and children weren't taught to read or write in the workhouses, just to work. Residents were forced to wear uniforms and were severely punished for violating house rules. In many ways, Victorian workhouses were not too different from being in modern-day prisons. In terms of health and medicine, there were significant advancements, but the overall standard of living was poor. As more factory jobs became available, the cities became overcrowded, dirty, and disease-ridden. A catastrophic outbreak of cholera in London killed over 11,000 people in one single year. Various doctors of the time were sure that the disease was coming from the dirty areas of the city, believing that it was being passed through the air. However, a prominent doctor at the time, Dr. John Snow, realised that a cesspit was leaking into the city's water pump, thus spreading it through the drinking water. Being a member of the upper class. If you found yourself in the upper class, life would have been fascinating and exciting. You would personally witness tremendous social, economical, and technological change. You would most likely find yourself living in a grand mansion or estate and enjoy a life of privilege. You would be well educated, and as a child, you would have been taught to read and write from an early age, either at home or at school. You would also have servants to attend to your daily needs and spend your days participating in leisure activities such as horseback riding, hunting, and attending social events such as parties and grand balls. The most wealthy people of the Victorian era were the royal family and their relatives, dukes, earls, and viscounts. If you travelled back in time and ended up as one of these people, you would have owned vast swathes of land and lived a very luxurious lifestyle. The upper class did not work in the mines or in factories. They often owned them. Others had well-paid jobs, such as lawyers, bankers, or doctors. If you were a wealthy Victorian time traveller with a good job, you would be one of the first to use and experience electricity in your home, or even enjoy listening to music on your gramophone or speaking on the first telephones of the world. You could also purchase fancy attire and take the steam train to seaside holidays in Brighton and Blackpool. This leads us nicely on to transportation. The Victorian era saw the expansion of the railway network as the steam engine was invented in this era, which made it much easier to travel around the country. Though if you were poor, you would have still mostly travelled by foot, horseback, or horse-drawn carriage. In order to keep the steam engines running to transport goods across the country, a sufficient amount of coal had to be mined. Working in coal mines was tough, and entire generations of families sometimes worked there to make enough money to survive. There were also significant developments in the steel industry, which meant that large factories opened as the country began producing products on a massive scale. The textile industry was also at the center of an industrial expansion. In the past, it would have taken a single person to weave and make cloth. However, advances meant that silk, wool, and cotton could be produced at much faster rates and exported around the British Empire at a fraction of the time and cost. In terms of social norms, strict codes of conduct governed daily life, particularly for the upper and middle classes. There were rigid expectations for how one should dress, behave, and interact with others based on class. Women in particular were expected to conform to strict societal expectations and were largely confined to domestic roles within the house. In terms of culture, the Victorian era was a time of great artistic and literary achievements. Not only Dickens, but William Thackeray and the Bronte sisters were among some of the many notable authors of the time, while painters such as J.M.W. Turner and John Everett Millais produced celebrated works. By the end of the Victorian era, life would vastly improve for most. Various laws were implemented that ensured safer working conditions in factories and mines. Also, laws were implemented that stopped child labour and instead required children to go to school. By the end of the Victorian period, larger cities such as London had much better sewage systems and sanitation. The famous Florence Nightingale played a role in promoting proper hygiene, which reduced the chance of sickness. Another memorable Victorian who believed in promoting better hygiene was Joseph Lister. Dr. Lister realised that by properly cleaning wounds and surgical instruments, you could reduce the risk of infection. Time travelling to Victorian England would expose you to a vastly different standard of living than the modern world, with strict societal norms, a rigid class distinction, and a wide disparity in living standards. So, while the Victorian era would have been a pleasant and enjoyable existence if you were a rich member of society, if you were poor, you would have experienced a rather tougher existence. Nevertheless, poorer families still enjoyed the comfort of a home and their family's company, and the era was renowned as a time of great artistic, literary, and technological advancement.